All right. Hello, everybody. Welcome to There Is No Place Like Production. I am Paige Cruz, and let's get started. This talk was initially inspired by the discourse a couple years ago that went around the Twitter sphere about I test and prod. And people had a lot of feelings about it, both on the extreme end, yes, we do, on the extreme other end, no, we absolutely don't. And I figured that I would share my story of the day that I learned we all test and prod from an outage that was a little bit caused by a change I made. To give you some context, I started my career as an engineer at New Relic, which is an enterprise monitoring company. And the thing is, if you work for one monitoring company, everywhere you go after that, you're seen as the monitoring expert. Doesn't matter if you were there for a month, a quarter, a year, you become the go-to person for better or for worse. And fast forward a few years later, a few startups, a few more on-call rotations, and I was hired as a senior site reliability engineer at a little company. But I kind of had this secret, which was I had been carrying a pager for 5 to 6 years and still hadn't really been the cause of an incident. And I kind of waited in fear because all my friends who were seasoned in ops, they had these horror stories of the time they deleted the prod DB, and I just felt like the big one was coming for me. And just to sprinkle on a little bit of my mindset at the time of this story, I was pretty stressed by the pandemic. We had just wrapped up a Kubernetes migration I didn't ask for. We were at about 80% department attrition, no manager, no director. Half my infra sister team was gone, and the SRE team was hanging on with just a couple of us. Oh yeah, and after that Kubernetes migration, we started immediately a CI/CD migration, which for the developers in the audience, I'm sorry, that's got to be rough. Moving infrastructure, moving how you get your code from A to B, and then just personal life stuff. So I'm that frog. That is me going into work on this day. Where did this all take place? I think it's always important to cloak the technical things with the business atmosphere. What was all this code supposed to be doing? Well, I was working at a cannabis technology platform that provided integrated solutions for consumers and businesses, which really meant we were this platform in the middle. We had consumers who were coming to say, I would like to purchase cannabis. Maybe I want it delivered to me. Maybe I want to look in a 5-mile radius. And then we had our customers who paid our bills, who were the dispensaries who were trying to sell cannabis. And right now, cannabis is still highly regulated, not federally legal, and so we had a very big responsibility to cross all of our T's and dot all of our I's. Okay. So one day, an intrepid engineer that I was just poking around in production, just trying to get the lay of the land and understand things. And I started to look at this service we had called Traffic. Yes, that is how it's pronounced, and that is how it is spelled. Not my choice. And I noticed something really upsetting to me. The logs for this thing, which was the main way that we monitored it and were able to inspect and answer questions about our systems, were unstructured. They were basically useless to me. I wasn't able to filter. I wasn't able to visualize in charts. I just had blobs of unstructured text that just were not helpful to me. Secondly, these logs didn't actually live where all the application logs lived. They lived in a tiny little Elk stack that the ops team had set up years ago. And like I mentioned, I'm an enterprise monitoring baby, so I had not touched Prom. I had not touched Elk. I'm like, what is KQL? Oh my God, take me back to what I know. Because what I wanted, I didn't want to write regex to structure and parse out information from unstructured logs. What I wanted was to emit them properly from source in a beautiful, formatted way so I could say, what IPs are hitting us, what routes are most popular, what times of day. I had a million questions, and Kibana was just not able to answer them with this kind of mess of logs. Okay. So what's traffic? High-level overview, it is like an air traffic controller for your system, kind of routing requests to the right area that you configure. So it's kind of in the middle and foundational to a lot of stuff. And at the time, I was still sort of new, sort of onboarding, and this was my mental model of our system. We would have a user say, is there any strain like Terpy Slurpy near me that I can get? It would go up, hit our CDN. Super important that we geographically nail down where this person was so we could serve relevant results. Also, you can't send cannabis across state lines, so that was an important part. From the CDN, it would hop over to our load balancer, hit a Kubernetes ingress, which was traffic, hit a Kubernetes service, and finally get to a pod where the developer's application was running. And you can see metrics, logs, and traces are going to one observability vendor, and our traffic logs are going to this little elk box. Okay, and as a primer, how did I want to go about making this change? Turns out it was a one-line config change. What could go wrong? One line. The way that we configured it was to use Helm, which is the package manager for Kubernetes. We would use Helm templates so we could define the Kubernetes YAML once and then overlay for each environment. Maybe we needed more replicas or we needed a little bit of a different configuration. So we would use Helm templating, use that to render the raw Kubernetes YAML, which we would then pass to Argo, which is, we'll get into that, but it basically deploys stuff to you to Kubernetes. And then Argo would render, and we would get the final, it would apply the final Kubernetes manifest. So that was one line change kind of going through that pipeline. All right, let's make the change. It is the morning of. I have a foolproof plan. I'm not, it's not my first rodeo, right? I'm always a little nervous when you're making a big change, especially to a component that most things rely on. So I was like, I'm going to make the PR, check. I'm going to test the heck out of it locally, check, check, check. I'm going to add a new deployment process just so folks are aware of what I am doing. I'm going to announce the changes so everyone knows and is aware. And I'm going to let it bake because that is the only way that I'm going to be able to tell before production if anything's going to go wrong. And then, look at me, schedule a quiet time to test this out in production. What happened? I made the PR. I asked the most senior tenured person on my team, the one that was remaining, to review it because I was still pretty nervous about this change. It passed PR checks. It passed our tests. Reviewer was like, looks good to me, one line change, right? And it auto-deployed to staging. Our staging environment was interesting, to say the least. It was the place where all of the merged code would kind of play together and see if everything would work together, but it was under-monitored. So we used what's called the scream test to make sure things were OK from staging to know when to promote to the next environment or acceptance. Nobody screamed, and I'm like, all right, let's go to staging. It sits in staging, which is our more official environment. It's supposed to be a little more stable. Our QA team would run nightly tests. And so after a day and night of running through those rigorous tests, came in, everything was fine. At this point, I was super confident, right? I had tested this locally. I mean, this one-line change had taken up 8 working hours at this point because I was that nervous about it. And I was so confident when it went to prod and the deploy status turned green, I went back to the circus that was being an SRE at this company, managing a bunch of priorities and trying to migrate CI/CD pipelines. But we know where the story's going, right? I was not bearing the lead. There's an incident that happens. All of a sudden, the incident Slack channel blew up in a way I had not yet seen before. There were people reporting in from all levels of the stack, all product areas. It looked like something really big was going really wrong. And I was like, ooh, was that my change? No, we tested. My friend, my peer approved. How could it have gone through so many environments with so many checks? Isn't that what acceptance and staging are for? There's no way. There's absolutely no way it's me, but I'm going to just watch this channel for a little bit. More people started reporting issues, and I said, look, I'm not primary on call. I do not need to be involved in this incident. I had a bit of a habit of lurking in incidents. I always wanted to learn a system by watching it break. But I said, no, we've got to get this migration done. Go back to work. There's no way it was your change. And then I got this Slack, hey, I think it was your traffic change. And this was in a DM, which my colleague thought was the kindest thing to do, was to privately tell me that he suspected at this point that it was my PR. Not in the incident channel, but a DM. And I said, oh, okay. Still have all these questions. I still don't know why. I want to go investigate. But in the heat of an incident, you actually don't need to be in investigation mode so much as you need to be in mitigation mode. And so if my friend thought it was your PR, the PR timing kind of lined up right, I hit merge, and then the Slack channel blew up, pretty good chance somehow, even if I didn't know how, it was my change. So I was like, you know what, let's revert it now, get that stuff out of production, and I joined the incident channel. I said, hey, I think my little change somehow did this, don't know how, don't know why. I've just rolled it back, let's watch things. And so we have all these people on the call, and very quickly, not slowly, very quickly, things started trending in the right direction. So I'm like, crap, how the heck did this one-line config change cause such a big kerfluffle? The incident closes, and all of a sudden I started to get lots of people privately DMing me to say, hey, it was kind of cool how you took responsibility. I really liked the way that you transparently communicated what you were doing and when. And I started to get the impression we had not a great culture about incidents and on-call and production things, because it is not noble to take responsibility and to communicate clearly, hey, my change did this thing. If you're going to get fired for that, you're not at the right company, because stuff just happens. Or as we would say here, shift happens. And then that night, my friend who I had been talking to, who's also an ops, texted me, #HugOps, and she was like, you must be so stressed, right? Like, it was your change. And she didn't mean it in a blamey way, right? But it was sort of this like, whew, what a stressful day that you were at the helm of. But I have been a student of the Learning from Incidents community, and we can kind of sum up our philosophy with this tweet from Amy Nguyen, which says, her coworker says, we need to find the root cause ASAP. She's like, there is no root cause. The root cause is that our processes are not robust enough to prevent a person from making this mistake. And her coworker's like, Amy, not right now. Like, we've got incident paperwork to do. And if you recall, gosh, 7-8 years ago now, when that engineer at AWS deployed a misconfiguration to S3 that kind of took down everything, including the AWS status page, they kind of pointed the fingers at that person, right? But it was kind of the processes, like, how is that even possible? How is it even possible for me to deploy a change to a very critical central component and not have these checks in place? So because of that, I was like, I don't blame myself. Everyone's trying to like put this blame on me, or it feels like there's sort of fingers pointing and people think that I'm taking all of this, I don't know, like being upset with myself. Instead of saying, that was a rough day at work, could have happened to anyone. I did the best that I could with my testing, with announcing. I'm pretty confident in everything I did with this PR, because it was only going to go wrong in production, and we'll find out why. All right, so the next day, after I calm down, I have a nice dinner, I walk into work, and I'm like, time to write an incident review, everybody's favorite. And all eyes were on me, on the incident, on my team, on infrastructure. We had people that I hadn't talked to who I thought did not care about infrastructure at all, asking really important questions. And I realized I had an opportunity to share more and to help folks learn about our system so that they in the future could be better partners to me in the reliability changes I wanted to make. But you kind of have to know things before you can act on them. So I'm like, all right, this is not an incident. No. This is a gift, actually. It's a gift from me to the company. No returns. We're going to learn. We are going to learn as an organization what happened here, what is up with our system, and what are some things we should do to address it. And I was like, all right, get in. We are learning from this incident. I took it very, very seriously, and I spent about probably 9-ish hours in total putting together a very comprehensive incident report. I made very pretty charts. I included static links to the dashboards in our monitoring tools so that anyone in the future could come read my review, click, and see the live charts themselves. So much better than just a screenshot, because you can continue to interrogate. And I had to think about it from the perspective of app developers, what would make sense to them, from my newly hired SREs who we were still onboarding, what they needed to know from their perspective, and of course, management and leadership who were like, whoa, better not happen again. Also, you better tell us what happened. And so we get to the incident review. Just a small note, don't love the word postmortem. If we could just replace that, that would be awesome. And what I was doing was essentially hard mode spot the difference. What made production different than staging, then acceptance, then local? And if you remember, we had unstructured logs. So I don't really have a nice thing to compare. And when I went into our observability tool, because this part of our system wasn't instrumented with events and spans, I was having to manually correlate things. And so I thought, okay, can't do it in the observability tool. What's the simplest thing I could do? Peeled it all the way back, looked at the raw, rendered the raw Kubernetes myself from before and after my PR, and then did a diff, and I found the answer, which we'll get to. My ideal workflow, though, at other companies I've been at, where there's tracing and events and spans instrumented, would have been to simply go to my observability tool, hit compare trace before and after my change, and I would have immediately surfaced what was wrong. So this was my dream world, but we are not there. We are in hard mode, spot the difference. All right, back to my mental model of the system. There is something missing from this diagram. And before we get that, because this is a developer audience, I'm just going to double-click really quickly into some of the DevOps-y things so that we're all kind of aware of how this came to be, because that is the really interesting part of this story. So Argo runs a reconciliation loop. This whole GitOps thing is like store your config as code, infra as code, everything as code, pipelines as code, config as code. And it has this really fun thing called the app of apps pattern. Argo calls a collection of Kubernetes YAML files an application, if that's not confusing enough. Your application can point to other applications known as the app of apps. So we're getting kind of this hierarchy. We're getting config pointing to other config, which is files in different repos. It's starting to get complicated. And additionally, like I mentioned, we're not using Helm for Helm. We're not doing like Helm releases. We're just using Helm for its templating part. So we would take our Helm templates, take our values files, override things, get our Kubernetes YAML, the raw manifest, and we never stored those. It was totally invisible to me throughout this whole process, like what the actual end diff was. And Argo would take that and then apply that Kubernetes YAML to update it. There's some gates, like obviously you don't have to auto-deploy everything, but like that's the flow. What was missing was a very important security sidecar that only ran in production to filter traffic from like bots and DOS attacks and really just make sure we were only letting trusted folks into our infrastructure. That sat in front of traffic. Probably should have moved that. We can see what the problem was. If that box was missing from the result of my PR, there was no gatekeeper at the door. And traffic and production didn't understand how to handle requests because it always was getting them from the sidecar. Or was getting the, like, yes, this is approved, go ahead, and route it. Whoa, whoa, a whole service I did not know about that only ran in prod that was invisible to me because of this hierarchy of YAML, this like pointing of this config to this repo, that config needs to get overlaid here, but only in production. And I'd found out where I had made the change, sort of like a Jenga tower. What I was looking at was just the cluster bootstrapping application, which is what SREs use to say this is the minimum operational and observable cluster. We will give this to the devs. Devs deploy your apps to it. So I was making a change in the middle of this, not looking at a downstream values.yaml file that only got applied in production that had this tiny little block that said sidecar, blah, 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 security tool. So what happened was I overwrote it with I put my logs, JSON formatted, everything looks good, in one values file. Not understanding the hierarchy of what happened, when everything got rendered, my one line clobbered the sidecar YAML. That would have popped up in like 2 or 3 layers down. So it really felt like a Jenga tower I had kind of fallen over with my changes. So I learned a lot. I was determined to help my organization learn, and I'll share with you a little bit about how I did that. So first, I think we're all familiar with an incident retro. You get together, here's the timeline, here's what happened. Maybe here's some gaps we should cover. They're not always fun, sometimes they're blamey, but I turned mine into sort of a classroom. Here's everything I learned about the system. Please correct me if I'm wrong. Please point out the edits you would make. Let's make this the most useful learning document, because this was a very big investment for our company to have that downtime and to interrupt everybody's day and our business critical interactions. But then, people were still asking questions. People weren't all able to join the incident retro. You shouldn't have everybody there. So I took a little roadshow to all of our communities of practice, which we called chapters. So first I started with the backend engineers. I'm like, y'all should know what the life of a request is. You should know it from originating from a mobile device, desktop, point of sale, iPad, whatever, to hit our CDN. You should know what happens before it gets to Kubernetes and before it gets to your pod, because there's like a lot of stuff along the way. But then I was like, okay, my front-end engineers are asking questions. I gotta help them out. How can I demystify some of this stuff? For them, we had a lovely chat. And then I took it to my team, where we had a standing weekly meeting called Study Time, where anyone could present on a technology that was relevant for our team, or, hey, I found this cool thing called Helm Test. Would have been super helpful for me. And so I took it at different levels to different groups to share what I learned and to see what knowledge gaps there were in these other parts of the org. And the way that I explained it to everybody, including the business folks, was I had essentially taken off our front door, or I had bricked up the outside of our front door so nothing could get in, but whoever was in the house could still talk to each other. And that simplified metaphor took me very, very far. People kind of instantly got it, and they're like, okay, stop talking about Kubernetes. I don't want to hear YAML. What are we going to do about it? And the other tactic that I took was looking at where our information silos were. We were a Ruby on Rails shop. We had Node, obviously, and we had Elixir folks. Nobody who knew Go, which is what Helm and Kubernetes and Argo are written in. So I knew I had to take time to explain, like, Helm templating, Go templating syntax errors, what is an Argo app of apps. I had to take the time to do that 101 level with the devs compared to my team, where I could be like, okay, look at the file hierarchy. You can see they were able to draw conclusions because it was a space they were familiar with. So this is what ended up. There was a very nice, beautiful lucid chart diagram version of this that I called Life of a Request, that I made a permanent part of our documentation that became like one of the most popular parts. People really were hungry to know what was going on in their system, but they never knew how to ask me and my team, probably because we were really grumpy from all the migrations we were doing. So this was a really lovely way to open the door and say, hey, what do you want to know about our system? We're here to talk about it. And reflecting back on this, trying to understand the differences between production and your other environments is a little bit like being a novice birder. And, I mean, in your heads, one of these is a crow and one of these is a raven. And to the untrained eye, you probably can't tell the difference. And I couldn't tell the difference between production and these other environments, not because I didn't understand observability or monitoring, not because I didn't understand like AWS infrastructure and Kubernetes ingress, but because it was so subtle, so different, and with a system that I hadn't yet had enough time to understand. And so I don't want to leave you with like this story of how I messed things up and then we learned. I want you to be able to act on these learnings yourself. What can you take back to your org to introduce a little bit of a learning culture? So a few things are, I'm a huge fan of distributed tracing. I don't think we're there yet with adoption. And Joel, my colleague, has written a fantastic article about our philosophy on how to get distributed tracing back on the right track. Because it would have been super nice to click a button that said compare traces and be like, wow, signal sciences is in this diagram and not in that diagram. Way better than rendering Helm templates and then doing diffs on the command line. If you're like, okay, I've got a group of people we want to learn, I've got an SRE talk called Cognitive Apprenticeship in Action with Alert Triage Hour of Power. And the gist is it's paired programming, but for exploring production together. It's a structured meeting. There's rules. So check that one out if you're like, I want to get my SRE team or my dev team to understand production more and be able to ask questions in our observability system. And then finally, if you're like, I want to be able to tell the story of the front door and the bricks, I've got directors and stuff I need to talk to. My colleague Eric has a fun talk on telling effective tales about production data. And a podcast on telemetry fluency if you're like, what's up with traces? I want to know. And the moral of the story is not just that I tested in prod that day, but that all of us tested in prod because prod is unlike any other environment you have along the path. And with that, I'm a little bit over time, so thank you.